Welcome. You have found your way to this quiet space at the end of your day. As you settle in, let your thoughts begin to slow. Let the concerns of the present fade, little by little. Tonight, we are travelling back to a time when winter was not an inconvenience but a test of survival. For the people of medieval Europe, the cold months were a reality that shaped every aspect of life. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Darkness arrived in the afternoon and lasted until morning. There was no electricity, no central heating, no insulation as we know it today. In this world, staying warm through the long winter nights required knowledge passed down through generations. It was not a matter of comfort, but of survival. How did families endure the cold? How did they sleep without freezing? Their methods were practical, built from necessity and refined over centuries. There was no single solution. It was a combination of many elements working together: materials, routines, architecture, and the simple warmth of other human bodies. Over the next while, we will move through the medieval winter night. We will see how homes were built to trap heat, how fires were carefully managed, how people dressed and ate and slept. We will follow the rhythm of darkness and the quiet rituals that made survival possible. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The climate of medieval Europe was not constant. It shifted over centuries, and those shifts determined whether families would thrive or struggle through the winter months. Between the years 950 and 1250, Europe experienced what historians call the medieval warm period. During these centuries, winters were relatively mild. Grain crops grew in regions that would later prove too cold for reliable harvests. In Scandinavia and northern England, farmers cultivated land that had once been marginal. Alpine tree lines crept higher up the mountainsides as temperatures rose by roughly half a degree to a full degree Celsius, above what would come later. This was a time of agricultural abundance. Harvests were consistent. Populations grew. Communities expanded into territories that had previously been too harsh to sustain permanent settlement. But around the year 1300, something began to change. The warm centuries were ending. The shift was gradual at first, then unmistakable. Summers became cooler and wetter. The growing season shortened. Crops that had once flourished began to fail. By the early 14th century, Europe was entering a period of regional cooling that would last for centuries. Historians now call this the Little Ice Age. The temperature drop was not uniform or constant. It came in pulses, periods of extreme cold interrupted by brief returns to milder conditions. But the overall trend was clear. Across the northern hemisphere, average temperatures fell by between half a degree and a degree and a half Celsius compared to the late 20th century. That may not sound dramatic, but the effects were severe. In Central Europe, winters grew colder and drier. Northeasterly winds from the continent brought bitter cold. Rivers that had flowed freely through the winter months began to freeze solid. The Thames in England and the Seine in France became sheets of ice thick enough to hold markets and festivals on their surfaces. These events, known as frost fairs, were not celebrations but symptoms of a colder world. Further north, the changes were even more drastic. In Scandinavia, sea ice expanded. Winter temperatures in some areas dropped by as much as 3.5 degrees Celsius. The Norse settlements in Greenland, which had survived for centuries, began to fail. The growing season became too short. The cod fisheries that had sustained coastal communities collapsed. By the 15th century, those distant settlements were abandoned entirely. Even the Mediterranean, usually insulated from the worst of northern cold, felt the shift. Winters became wetter and colder than before. Droughts that had once been rare became regular. Livestock, sheep and cattle that grazed the dry hills, died in large numbers during unseasonably harsh winters. Tax revenues fell. Social unrest followed. Across the Atlantic, in the interior of North America, indigenous populations experienced their own disruptions. Agricultural communities that had relied on maize cultivation found their growing seasons shortened. Some groups shifted away from settled farming and returned to nomadic hunting patterns. But it was not just the gradual cooling that made survival difficult. It was the unpredictability. Extreme weather events became more common. Sudden floods washed away fields. Hailstorms destroyed crops on the verge of harvest. Snowstorms arrived without warning and buried entire villages. In the year 1315, Europe entered a period known as the Great Famine. Heavy rains fell throughout the spring and summer, preventing grain from ripening. Harvests failed across the continent. By winter, food stores were dangerously low. People weakened by malnutrition faced the cold months with depleted bodies. Thousands died, not from freezing, but from the combination of hunger and cold. The Great Famine lasted until 1317, but its effects lingered. Populations that had grown during the medieval warm period were suddenly vulnerable. The people who survived the famine entered the following winters already weakened. Their capacity to endure cold had been reduced, and the cold kept coming. In 1359, Italian chroniclers recorded snowfalls of extraordinary depth. Snow accumulated so high that it trapped people inside their homes for days. Roofs collapsed under the weight. In some regions, families had to dig tunnels through the snow just to reach their livestock or their wood stores. In the winter of 1389, in the region of Lozère in southern France, snow caused the collapse of entire farmsteads. The weight was simply too much for the timber frames to bear. People died, crushed beneath the roofs that had once sheltered them. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a new reality. Winter was no longer predictable. It was a season that required constant vigilance, careful preparation, and an understanding that survival could not be taken for granted. Medieval people did not have the scientific language to describe what was happening. They did not speak of climate cycles or average temperature changes, but they felt the effects in their bodies, in their harvests, in the thickness of the ice on the river, and so they adapted. They built their homes differently. They changed how they dressed, how they stored food, how they managed their fires. They learned to live with the cold, not by conquering it, but by learning to endure it. The architecture of that endurance began with the simplest principle. Warmth must be trapped close. It must be held in small spaces, layered carefully, and shared among those who needed it. The medieval home, the medieval bed, the medieval body, all became systems designed to conserve heat in a world that had grown colder. This was the climate they inherited, and this was the world in which they learned to survive the winter night. The medieval home was not designed to be beautiful. It was designed to keep people alive. Every material, every structural choice, every layer of construction served a single purpose: to slow the transfer of heat from the inside to the outside. The houses of medieval Europe were machines for the conservation of warmth, and their effectiveness depended on a principle that inhabitants understood intuitively, even if they could not name it. Still air is an insulator. Moving airstrips heat away. The goal, then, was to trap as much still air as possible within the walls, the floors, the roofs, and even the clothing of the people who lived inside. For the common people, the peasants and labourers who made up the vast majority of the population, the primary building, material was not stone but a combination of timber, clay, and straw. This method of construction is known as wattle and daub, and it was remarkably effective. The process began with a timber frame. Wooden posts were set into the ground or mounted on a stone foundation, and horizontal beams connected them to form the skeleton of the building. Between these timber supports, builders wove thin, flexible branches, hazel, willow, or ash, into a lattice. This lattice was called the wattle. Once the wattle was in place, workers applied the daub. This was a thick mixture of wet clay, mud, and chopped straw, sometimes mixed with animal dung or lime for added durability. The daub was pressed into the gaps of the wattle, filling every space, and then smoothed over both sides of the wall. As it dried, it hardened into a solid, dense surface. The straw was the key. When mixed into the clay, it created millions of tiny air pockets within the wall. These pockets interrupted the flow of heat, cold. Air from outside could not easily pass through, and warm air from inside was slowed in its escape. The wall became a barrier not because it was thick or heavy, but because it was filled with trapped, unmoving air. This type of wall also had a flexibility that stone lacked. As the seasons changed, the timber frame would expand and contract slightly. The daub, being somewhat elastic, moved with it. Builders described a well-made wattle and daub wall as being well sprung into the frame, meaning it fit tightly without cracking or pulling away. Stone, by contrast, presented a different set of challenges. For those who could afford it, nobles, wealthy merchants, and religious institutions, stone was the material of choice. It was permanent, fire-resistant, and projected an image of stability and power. But stone is a poor insulator. It has what is called high thermal mass, meaning it can absorb and store a great deal of heat, but it does so slowly. When a stone wall is cold, it draws warmth away from the air around it. It acts as a heat sink. In a stone hall, even with a roaring fire in the centre of the room, the walls themselves remained cold to the touch. Sitting near a stone wall in winter was uncomfortable. The cold radiated inward, chilling anyone who leaned against it. To counteract this, inhabitants of stone buildings used what might be called soft architecture. They hung heavy wool tapestries on the walls, but not flush against the stone. Instead, the tapestries were suspended several inches away from the surface, creating a pocket of still air between the fabric and the wall. This air gap acted as insulation, reducing the amount of cold that radiated into the room. The tapestries themselves, being woven wool, also trapped air within their fibres, adding another layer of thermal resistance. In the homes of the very wealthy, multiple tapestries might be layered, creating even deeper air pockets. The visual effect was one of richness and decoration, but the primary function was warmth. For the floor, the principle was the same. Cold rose from the ground, especially in homes built directly on packed earth. To create a barrier, people scattered loose straw across the floor. This layer of straw was not merely for cleanliness or comfort, though it served those purposes as well. It was insulation. The straw kept feet from direct contact with the cold ground, and it added a small but significant layer of trapped air between the earth and the living space. In wealthier homes, woven rush mats or even wool rugs served the same function. The material varied, but the intent was always the same: create distance between the body and the cold surface below. The roof was another critical component. Most peasant homes were topped with thatch, bundles of straw or reeds laid in overlapping rows and bound tightly to the wooden frame. Thatch was abundant, renewable, and remarkably effective as insulation. The thick layer of plant material created countless air pockets, and the natural oils in the straw made it somewhat water-resistant. But thatch also served a second purpose. It allowed smoke to escape. In homes without chimneys, and this included the vast majority of medieval dwellings, smoke from the central hearth rose naturally through the rafters and filtered out through the thatch. The roof was porous enough to let the smoke dissipate, but dense enough to retain heat. This required a careful balance. If the roof was too tightly packed, smoke would accumulate inside, choking the inhabitants. If it was too loose, heat would escape too quickly, and rain would leak through. Skilled thatchers knew how to achieve the right density, layering the straw in a way that managed both ventilation and insulation. The height of the house also mattered. For smoke to rise above the living area, the ceiling needed to be high enough, typically around 20 feet from the floor to the peak of the roof. This height allowed the smoke to gather in the upper space, leaving the lower air relatively clear for breathing. It also created a temperature gradient. The warmest air rose to the top, while the cooler, denser air remained at floor level, where the fire's radiant heat could warm it again. Windows presented a problem. Glass was expensive and rare. Only churches and the homes of the very wealthy had glazed windows, and even then the glass was often thick, uneven, and full of imperfections. For everyone else, window openings were simply holes in the wall, necessary for light but also pathways for cold drafts. To manage this, people used shutters. These were solid wooden panels that could be closed at night or during storms, sealing the opening entirely. In some cases, the shutters were lined with fabric or covered with oiled parchment to allow a small amount of diffused light while still blocking the wind. Parchment and treated paper were sometimes stretched across window frames. These materials were translucent, allowing light to pass through, but they were fragile and had to be replaced regularly. In the coldest months or in the most exposed rooms, window openings might be sealed entirely with wattle and daub, or packed with straw and mortar, sacrificing light for warmth. In stone buildings, particularly monasteries and manor houses, there was another option. During winter, masons might temporarily fill in window openings with loose stone and mortar, creating a solid wall for the duration of the cold season. When spring arrived, the mortar could be chipped away and the windows reopened. The medieval home, then, was not a static structure. It changed with the seasons. It breathed. It required constant maintenance and adjustment. Cracks in the daub had to be patched. Thatch had to be inspected and repaired. Shutters had to be fitted tightly. Tapestries had to be hung and rehung as they settled. But when it was done well, the result was effective. A peasant cottage built with care could maintain a livable interior temperature even when the air outside was well below freezing. The walls, the floor, the roof, each layer contributed to the same goal. Warmth was small. It was held close. It was trapped in the invisible spaces between fibres of straw, in the air pockets behind tapestries, in the loose scatter of rushes on the floor, and it was enough. The medieval home could not be sealed. It had to breathe. This was not a flaw in construction, it was a necessity. The central hearth required a constant supply of oxygen to burn, and the smoke it produced had to escape. Without airflow, the fire would suffocate, and the inhabitants would suffocate with it. The challenge was to manage that airflow, to allow enough ventilation to sustain the fire and clear the smoke, but not so much that the warmth was carried away. In the earliest medieval homes, and in the homes of common people throughout the period, there was no chimney. The fire burned in a pit or on a raised stone platform in the centre of the room. Smoke rose naturally, following the principles of convection. Hot air is lighter than cold air, so it drifted upward toward the roof. The shape of the house facilitated this movement. The roof was typically peaked, with a high central ridgeline. As smoke rose, it accumulated in the upper space, far above the heads of the people sitting or sleeping below. The heat from the smoke warmed the air in the rafters, but the living space remained relatively clear. The smoke did not simply hang there. It had to escape, and it did so through the roof itself. Thatch, as mentioned earlier, was porous. Smoke filtered slowly through the layers of straw, dissipating into the open air. In some homes, there was a deliberate opening at the peak of the roof, a simple gap left between the two sides of the thatch. This was sometimes called a windeye, an old word that would later evolve into the term window. The windeye allowed smoke to exit more quickly, but it also created a draft. Cold air from outside was pulled down through the opening, mixing with the warm air rising from the fire. This circulation was part of the system. It kept the air moving, prevented smoke from becoming too dense, and maintained a temperature gradient that was surprisingly stable. But the system only worked if the house was the right height. If the ceiling was too low, smoke would accumulate at head level, filling the room with choking fumes. If the ceiling was too high, the heat would dissipate too quickly, and the living space would remain cold. The standard height of around 20 feet was not arbitrary. It was the result of generations of trial and refinement. Still, the process was not perfect. Even in a well-designed house, the air was often hazy. Eyes stung. Clothing and bedding absorbed the smell of smoke. Respiratory problems were common among people who spent their lives in smoky interiors. But the alternative, allowing the fire to go out, was far worse. As the medieval period progressed, a new architectural feature began to appear: the chimney. The chimney changed the sensory landscape of the home. Instead of rising freely through the room, smoke was channeled into a narrow flue built into the wall. The flue created a strong upward draft, pulling smoke out of the living space much more efficiently than an open roof ever could. The result was a room that was clearer, quieter, and less irritating to the lungs. But the chimney also changed the way heat moved through the house. With a central hearth, radiant heat spread in all directions. People could sit around the fire and feel its warmth on every side. With a wall-mounted fireplace, heat radiated primarily in one direction, outward into the room. The back and sides of the fireplace absorbed much of the heat, and a significant portion was lost up the chimney itself. To counteract this, people developed strategies. One of the most common was the settle, a high-backed wooden bench placed near the fireplace. The tall back of the settle acted as a reflector, bouncing radiant heat back toward the person sitting on the bench. It also served as a windbreak, shielding the sitter from drafts that might be coming from elsewhere in the room. The settle was often paired with a small table. During meals, the table could be placed in front of the settle, creating a semi-enclosed space where warmth was concentrated. After the meal, the table might be moved aside, and the bench used simply as a warm seat for evening tasks, spinning, mending, or quiet conversation. For smaller, more targeted warmth, there were portable braziers. These were shallow metal pans, sometimes with legs, sometimes flat-bottomed, filled with hot coals from the hearth. A brazier could be moved from room to room, placed under a table to warm the feet, or set near a bed to take the chill out of the air before sleep. But braziers were dangerous. They had no chimney, no flue. The coals burned in open air, and if the ventilation in the room was poor, they produced carbon monoxide, a colourless, odourless gas that could cause drowsiness, confusion, and death. Accidental poisonings were not uncommon. People would fall asleep near a brazier in a sealed room and never wake up. Braziers were also a fire hazard. If tipped over, the hot coals could ignite straw bedding, wooden floors, or loose clothing. Legal records and chronicles from the period include numerous accounts of house fires caused by overturned braziers. In some towns, their use was restricted or banned outright during particularly dry seasons. Despite these dangers, braziers remained popular because they provided warmth exactly where it was needed. They were portable, immediate, and effective, qualities that outweighed the risks in the minds of people who lived in constant cold. The flow of air through the house was not just about smoke and ventilation. It was also about managing drafts. Medieval buildings, even well-constructed ones, were full of small gaps. Gaps between the daub and the timber frame, gaps around door frames, gaps where shutters did not fit quite flush. These gaps allowed cold air to seep in, creating currents that could strip warmth away from anyone sitting nearby. To reduce drafts, people used fabric. Curtains or heavy cloths were hung over doorways, creating a double barrier. When someone passed through, they moved through 2 layers of fabric, reducing the amount of cold air that entered with them. In manor houses and castles, entire sections of rooms might be curtained off, creating smaller, more easily heated spaces within the larger hall. Beds, too, were often enclosed with curtains. The bed curtains served multiple purposes. They provided privacy in communal sleeping spaces, they blocked drafts, and they trapped the warmth generated by the sleepers' bodies, creating a microclimate within the enclosed space that was significantly warmer than the surrounding room. The idea of the breathing house might seem contradictory. How could a house be both insulated and ventilated? How could it hold warmth while also allowing air to move? The answer lies in control. Medieval builders understood, through practice and observation, that air movement could not be eliminated. It could only be managed. The trick was to allow ventilation where it was needed, at the hearth through the roof, while minimising it everywhere else. Walls were made as airtight as possible. Windows were shuttered, doors were fitted with heavy cloth. The fire itself created a natural draw, pulling air through the house in a predictable pattern. When done well, the result was a house that breathed just enough. The air was fresh enough to sustain life. The fire burned steadily. The smoke escaped. And the warmth, though it could never be completely contained, was held close enough to make the difference between survival and freezing. The medieval home was not comfortable by modern standards. It was drafty, smoky, dim, and often damp. But it worked. It allowed families to endure months of cold, to sleep through freezing nights, and to wake again in the morning. And that was all it needed to do. The fire was the centre of everything. It provided heat. It provided light. It cooked food. It dried wet clothing. It kept predators and vermin at bay. It marked the boundary between the human world and the cold, dark wilderness outside. Without it, survival through a medieval winter was impossible. But fire was not a passive resource. It required constant attention, careful management, and a deep understanding of how combustion worked. A fire that went out in the middle of the night was more than an inconvenience. It was a crisis. Reigniting a fire from nothing was a laborious process. The most common method involved flint and steel. A piece of flint, a hard, glassy stone, was struck sharply against a piece of steel, creating a spark. That spark had to land on a piece of tinder, char cloth, dried moss or fine wood shavings that would catch and begin to smoulder. The smouldering tinder was then carefully transferred to a small bundle of dry grass or straw, which was blown gently to coax it into flame. Finally, the flame was fed with progressively larger pieces of wood until a sustainable fire was established. In good conditions, with dry materials and skilled hands, this process might take 5 or 10 minutes. In cold, damp conditions, with numb fingers and wet tinder, it could take much longer. And if the tinder was too wet or the sparks failed to catch, the process could fail entirely. For this reason, keeping a fire alive overnight was a priority. The solution was a device called the Couvre-Feu. The Couvre-Feu was a dome-shaped cover, usually made of earthenware or metal, that was placed over the embers of the fire at night. The name comes from the French words meaning cover fire. The dome restricted the flow of oxygen to the coals, causing them to burn very slowly. So slowly that they would smoulder for hours without going out entirely. By morning, the coals beneath the couvre-feu would still be hot. A household member could remove the cover, rake the embers together, add small pieces of dry kindling, and blow gently to revive the flame. Within minutes, the fire would be burning again, and the cold night could be pushed back for another day. The couvre-feu was not just a practical tool, it was a ritual. Covering the fire was one of the last tasks of the evening, a signal that the day was ending and the household was settling into the vulnerable hours of darkness. In some communities, it was the responsibility of the eldest member of the family. In others, it was the task of whoever had tended the fire throughout the day. The importance of this practice extended beyond the individual home. In medieval towns and cities, where houses were built close together and often constructed largely of wood and thatch, an uncontrolled fire could spread quickly, consuming entire neighbourhoods. To prevent this, many towns instituted a curfew. The word curfew itself is derived from couvre-feu. At a designated hour, usually sunset or shortly thereafter, a bell would ring. This was the signal for all households to cover their fires and extinguish any open flames. The streets would grow quiet. The glow of hearths would dim behind shuttered windows. The town would settle into a controlled darkness. The curfew was not merely a suggestion. In many places it was enforced by law. Town watchmen patrolled the streets, checking for signs of uncontrolled fire or open flames. Violators could be fined or, in repeated cases, subject to harsher penalties. The safety of the community depended on collective compliance. The curfew bell also served a psychological function. It marked the transition from the active, productive hours of daylight to the passive, restful hours of night. It was a communal acknowledgement that the day was over, that the cold and darkness had arrived, and that the safest course of action was to retreat indoors, bank the fires, and wait for dawn. The type of fire also mattered. Not all fires were built the same way. For cooking, a hot, fast-burning fire was needed. This required dry hardwood, oak, ash or beech, split into small pieces and arranged to allow plenty of airflow. The flames would be intense and the heat immediate. For overnight warmth, a slow, steady fire was better. This was achieved by using larger logs, packed more tightly, with less airflow. The goal was not intense heat, but sustained warmth. Such a fire would produce fewer flames and more glowing coals, which radiated heat for hours. The choice of fuel also depended on availability. In forested areas, wood was abundant. In regions where trees were scarce, people burned peat, dense, partially decomposed plant material dug from bogs. Peat burned slowly and produced a distinctive earthy smoke. It provided less heat than wood, but it was better than nothing. In some coastal areas, dried seaweed or animal dung was used. Dung, when dried, burned surprisingly well. It was not the preferred fuel, but it was free, renewable and effective. Peasants who could not afford to buy firewood, or who lived in treeless regions, relied on it heavily. The placement of the fire also evolved over time. In the earliest medieval homes, as already mentioned, the fire was in the centre of the room. This allowed heat to radiate in all directions, but it also meant that the entire household had to organise their activities around the fire's location. Furniture, if any, was arranged in a circle. People sat facing inward, toward the warmth. With the advent of the wall-mounted fireplace and chimney, the fire moved to the side of the room. This freed up the centre space for other uses, tables, benches, storage. But it also meant that heat was concentrated in one area. People had to position themselves near the fireplace to feel its full benefit. The fireplace itself became a piece of architecture. In wealthier homes, it was built of stone or brick with a wide opening and a deep hearth. The walls of the fireplace absorbed heat during the day and radiated it slowly into the room at night, providing a gentler, more sustained warmth than an open fire. Some fireplaces included features designed to improve efficiency. A fireback, a cast iron plate placed at the rear of the fireplace, reflected heat forward into the room rather than allowing it to be absorbed by the rear wall. In very large halls, multiple fireplaces might be built along the length of the room, ensuring that no one had to sit too far from a source of heat. But even with these improvements, the fireplace was less efficient than the central hearth. A significant portion of the heat was lost up the chimney. The draft necessary to pull smoke upward also pulled warm air out of the room. On particularly cold nights, sitting near a fireplace could be uncomfortable. Warm on the side facing the flames, cold on the side facing the room. This is why the settle, mentioned earlier, became such a common piece of furniture. It allowed people to trap the warmth close to their bodies, creating a small zone of comfort within the larger, colder space. Fire was also a source of light, and in the winter months, when darkness lasted for 16 hours or more, light was precious. The fire's glow allowed people to continue working after sunset, spinning thread, repairing tools, preparing food. But the light was limited. Beyond a few feet from the hearth, the room faded into shadow. For tasks that required more light, people used rushlights or candles, which we will explore in more detail later, but even these were supplementary. The fire remained the primary source of illumination, and its flickering light defined the rhythm of the evening. There was also a social dimension to the fire. It was the place where the family gathered, stories were told, news was shared, children were taught. The warmth of the fire and the warmth of companionship were inseparable. To sit by the fire was to be part of the household. To be excluded from the fire was to be cast out, both literally and symbolically. The hearth was sacred in a way that went beyond religion. It was the heart of the home. Its maintenance was a responsibility shared by everyone in the household, but especially by the women, who tended it throughout the day while preparing meals, heating water, and drying clothes. When a family moved to a new home, one of the first acts was to light the hearth. When someone died, the fire might be allowed to go out as a sign of mourning, and reigniting it afterward was a ritual of renewal. The fire was never just a fire, it was survival, it was community, it was continuity. And in the deep cold of the medieval winter, it was the difference between life and death. Evening in a medieval household did not arrive suddenly. It came gradually, as the light outside the windows dimmed and the temperature began to drop. By mid-afternoon in the depths of winter, the sun was already low on the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the fields and through the narrow streets of towns. By 4 o'clock, in northern regions, the sky was fading to grey. By 5, it was dark. The transition to night was not marked by the flipping of a switch. There was no artificial light to hold back the darkness. Instead, the household moved through a series of tasks, each one preparing for the long hours ahead. Animals had to be brought in or secured. If livestock were kept in a separate barn, they had to be fed and bedded down with straw. If they shared the longhouse, as many did, they had to be settled in their section of the building. Chickens were shut into coops to protect them from foxes. Dogs were brought inside or positioned near the door. Shutters were closed. In homes with glazed windows, this was less urgent, but in most houses, the wooden shutters were the only barrier against the wind. Each window was checked, the shutters pulled tight and latched. If a shutter was loose or warped, it might be wedged shut with a piece of cloth or wood. Doors were secured. The main door was closed and barred from the inside. In some homes, a heavy cloth or piece of leather was hung over the door to block drafts. Every gap was a place where cold could enter, and every gap had to be addressed. Food for the evening meal was prepared. In most households, this meant adding ingredients to the pot of pottage that had been simmering over the fire all day. Fresh water might be drawn from the well or the river, brought inside and stored in wooden or clay vessels. Bread, if there was any, was set out. Ale was poured. The meal itself was eaten near the fire, often in silence or with quiet conversation. There was no rush. Eating was a practical act, a way to fuel the body for the cold night ahead. The warmth of the food, the warmth of the fire, and the presence of the family provided a brief interlude of comfort before the longer, colder hours of sleep. After the meal, the work of the evening continued. For women, this often meant spinning or sewing by the firelight. Wool had to be carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Torn clothing had to be mended. These were tasks that required light, and the fire provided just enough. For men, evening tasks might include repairing tools, carving wooden implements, or simply sitting near the fire and talking. Children played quietly or helped with small chores, fetching wood from the pile, tidying the sleeping area, or feeding scraps to the dogs. But as the night deepened, these activities slowed. The fire, which had been burning brightly during the meal, was allowed to die down. Large logs were not added. Instead, the flames were left to consume what remained, reducing the wood to glowing coals. This was intentional. A roaring fire was not needed during sleep. What was needed was a bed of coals that could be banked and preserved until morning. When the household was ready to sleep, the final ritual began. First, the coals were gathered. Using a long iron poker or a wooden paddle, someone, usually the head of the household or the person responsible for the fire, raked the embers into a compact pile in the centre of the hearth. This concentrated the heat, ensuring that the coals would burn as slowly as possible. Next, the couvre-feu was brought out. It had been warming near the fire so it would not crack when placed over the hot coals. The dome was carefully positioned over the pile of embers, covering them completely but not smothering them. A small gap at the base allowed just enough air to keep the coals alive. With the couvre-feu in place, the fire's glow dimmed. The bright orange light faded to a dull red, barely visible through the gaps in the dome. The room grew darker. The temperature, which had been warm near the fire, began to equalize, spreading more evenly through the house but also beginning its slow descent toward the cold of the outside air. This was the moment when the household became most vulnerable. The fire was no longer a source of active warmth. It was a seed, a potential, something that had to be carefully preserved so it could bloom again in the morning. In towns, this moment was synchronized. The curfew bell rang, a deep, resonant sound that carried through the streets. It was a reminder and a command. Cover your fires, extinguish your candles, retreat into your homes. The bell was rung from the church tower or the town hall, and its sound marked the official end of the day. After the bell, the streets were expected to be empty. Anyone found outside without good reason might be questioned by the watch. Open flames were forbidden. The town settled into a collective stillness. The purpose was twofold. First, it reduced the risk of fire. A single spark from an uncovered hearth, carried by the wind, could ignite a thatched roof. Within minutes, an entire block could be ablaze. By ensuring that all fires were covered at the same hour, the risk was minimized. Second, it reinforced social order. The curfew bell was a statement of authority. It said, "This is the time for rest. This is the time to stop working, stop moving, stop making noise." It was a way of controlling the population, yes, but it was also a way of protecting it. For those living in the countryside, far from the sound of any bell, the ritual was the same but more personal. There was no external signal, only the rhythm of the day and the habits formed over a lifetime. The fire was covered when it was time. The household went to bed when the tasks were done. Before sleep there were small preparations, beds were checked, straw mattresses were fluffed or smoothed, blankets were pulled out from where they had been airing near the fire. Heated stones, rocks that had been placed in the fire hours earlier, were wrapped in cloth and tucked into the bed to warm the cold spots. Nightcaps were put on. These were not optional. A significant amount of body heat is lost through the head, and in a cold room, an uncovered scalp could make sleep uncomfortable or even dangerous. Everyone, from infants to the elderly, wore some kind of head covering to bed. Shoes, if they had been worn during the day, were removed and placed near the fire to dry. Outer garments, cloaks, tunics were either hung on pegs or folded and used as additional blankets. Every piece of fabric had a purpose. Then, one by one, the members of the household climbed into bed. In most homes there was only one bed, or at most two. Families slept together, arranged by custom and necessity. The chuang was not just a place to rest, it was a shared thermal unit, a collaborative effort to stay warm. The room, now dark except for the faint glow of the covered coals, grew quiet. Outside, the wind might be blowing, snow might be falling, the temperature might be dropping well below freezing, but inside, beneath the heavy wool blankets, surrounded by the warmth of other bodies, sleep was possible. The couvre-feu sat on the hearth, holding the embers through the night. The fire did not roar, it did not crackle, it simply endured, a small persistent warmth waiting for the morning. And the household, having done all it could to prepare, surrendered to the darkness and the cold, trusting that the rituals of the evening would carry them through to the dawn. The bell rang at dusk, and the sound carried across the entire town. It was not a cheerful sound, it was not meant to be. The curfew bell was deep and resonant, designed to travel through narrow streets, over rooftops, and into the farthest corners of the settlement. It rang slowly, with long pauses between each stroke, giving people time to hear it, to register what it meant, and to act. In winter, when darkness came early, the bell might ring as early as 4 or 5 in the afternoon. In summer, it rang later. But in the cold months, when the risk of fire was greatest and the need for communal discipline most urgent, the bell marked the boundary between the visible world and the unseen one. The moment the bell began to ring, activity in the streets changed. Shopkeepers who had been lingering in their doorways turned and went inside. People carrying water from the well quickened their pace. Children playing in the alleys were called home by their parents. The town began to empty. This was not optional. The curfew was law. In many medieval towns, it was enforced by appointed watchmen who walked the streets after the bell had rung, checking for violations. A household with an uncovered fire, visible through a window or chimney, could be fined. A person found wandering the streets without justification could be detained and questioned. The penalties varied depending on the town and the severity of the offence. In some places, a first violation might result in a warning or a small fine. Repeat offenders faced larger fines, public shaming, or even brief imprisonment. The rules were strict because the consequences of a single fire could be catastrophic. Medieval towns were dense. Houses were built close together, often sharing walls. The structures were made primarily of wood and thatch, materials that burned quickly once ignited. A fire that started in one building could spread to neighbouring structures within minutes. There was no organised fire brigade, no pumps, no reliable way to extinguish a large blaze. Once a fire took hold, entire neighbourhoods could be lost. History bears this out. Records from medieval Europe are filled with accounts of devastating urban fires. In 1212, a fire in London destroyed a significant portion of the city. In 1188, a fire in Troyes, France, consumed much of the town centre. Similar disasters occurred in York, Rouen, and countless smaller settlements. The curfew bell was one of the few preventative measures available. But the bell was not only about fire prevention, it also served a social function. It imposed rhythm on the day. It told people when to stop working, when to retreat indoors, when to rest. In a world without clocks in every home, without electric lights to extend the working hours, the curfew bell was a shared signal that organised collective behaviour. For those who lived alone or in small households, the sound of the bell could be comforting. It meant that across the town, others were doing the same thing, closing their shutters, covering their fires, settling in for the night. There was a solidarity in that shared action, a sense that the community was moving together through the rhythm of the day. For others, particularly the young or the restless, the bell might have been frustrating. It cut short conversations, interrupted work, and enforced an early retreat into the dark, confined space of the home. But frustration did not exempt anyone from compliance. The bell rang and people obeyed. Inside the homes, the sound of the bell triggered the final preparations. If the fire had not yet been banked, it was done now. The couvre-feu was placed. Candles and rushlights were extinguished. Shutters were checked one last time. The household turned inward, away from the streets and the night. The watchmen who patrolled after curfew carried lanterns, usually enclosed in metal frames to protect the flame from wind. Their role was not to provide light for others, but to monitor compliance and to respond to emergencies. If a fire broke out, the watchman would sound an alarm, ringing a handbell or shouting through the streets to rouse the town. People would emerge with buckets, forming human chains to pass water from wells or rivers to the blaze, but these efforts were often too little, too late. Prevention, through the curfew, was far more effective than any attempted cure. In the countryside, far from the reach of any town bell, the rhythm was similar but less formalised. There was no external authority to dictate when fires should be covered or when people should go to bed. Instead, the rhythm was dictated by the sun, by the body's natural tiredness, and by the practical needs of the household. Farmers and labourers rose with the dawn and worked as long as the light allowed. When darkness fell, there was little point in continuing. Tasks that required visibility, ploughing, repairing fences, tending animals in distant fields, could not be done in the dark. So people came inside, ate, completed a few small tasks by firelight, and went to bed. But even in the countryside, the principle was the same. The fire was covered. The household withdrew from the cold and the dark. The night was surrendered to, not fought against. The curfew bell, whether heard in a crowded town or imagined in the quiet of a rural cottage, represented an acknowledgement. The day was over. The warmth and safety of the home were all that remained. And until the sun rose, again, the world outside was not a place for human activity. There was also a spiritual dimension to the curfew. Night, in the medieval imagination, was not neutral. It was a time when the boundary between the living world and the spiritual world grew thin. Darkness was associated with danger, with unseen forces, with the unknown. The curfew bell marked the moment when people retreated from that uncertain realm and enclosed themselves within the protective boundaries of their homes. Prayers were often said at this time. Families might gather briefly before bed to recite a simple prayer of protection, asking for safety through the night. Children were taught to cross themselves before sleep. These were not merely religious habits, they were psychological anchors, ways of asserting control over a situation that felt, at some level, beyond control. The bell itself, rung from a church tower, carried religious authority. It was not just a civic tool, but a sacred one. The church's role in organising the rhythms of daily life, through bells for prayer, for curfew, for alarm, reinforced its centrality in medieval society. The sound of the bell was the sound of order, of community, of shared belief in a structured world. And so, when the bell rang, people responded not only out of obedience to law, but out of a deeper sense of participation in something larger than themselves. They were part of a town, part of a community, part of a system that had been tested over generations and found to work. The streets emptied, the fires were covered, the night began. In the silence that followed the last stroke of the bell, the town settled. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and pale in the cold air. Behind shuttered windows, the faint glow of banked fires created small points of warmth in the gathering darkness. Dogs barked occasionally. A door creaked. A voice called out, muffled by walls and distance. And then, gradually, even those sounds faded. The town grew still. The curfew had done its work. The community had withdrawn into itself, into the small, fragile warmth of individual hearths, and the long winter night could begin. Darkness in winter did not arrive as a sudden event. It crept in slowly, filling the spaces between buildings, settling into the corners of rooms, pooling beneath tables and along walls. By 4 in the afternoon, the light outside was already failing. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long shadows that stretched across fields and through narrow streets. The quality of the light changed. It became thinner, greyer, less capable of illuminating detail. Objects that had been clear in the midday sun began to blur at the edges. Inside the home, this transition was even more pronounced. Medieval windows were small, and in many homes they were few. The amount of natural light that entered the interior was limited even at the best of times. As the sun moved lower, that light diminished rapidly. Corners that had been visible in the morning became indistinct. The far side of the room faded into shadow. People adjusted their activities accordingly. Tasks that required good light, sewing fine stitches, reading, detailed carving, were completed earlier in the day, while the sun was still high. By late afternoon, the work shifted to tasks that could be done by feel or by the dim glow of the fire. Spinning wool, for instance, was a common evening activity. The spinner's hands knew the texture of the fibre, the tension of the thread. Eyes were helpful but not essential. Food preparation continued near the fire where the flames provided both heat and light. Stirring the pot, adding wood to the fire, checking the bread in the ashes, these were tasks that could be done in the flickering uneven light of the hearth. But as the darkness deepened, even these activities slowed. The fire, which had been burning brightly during the afternoon, was allowed to settle. The flames died down, leaving a bed of glowing coals. The light in the sissy room dimmed further. This was the threshold moment. The household was moving from the active hours of the day into the passive hours of the night. The transition was not marked by a clock or a schedule. It was felt in the body, a tiredness that came with the fading light, a natural slowing of energy. Modern research into human biology suggests that this response is not cultural but physiological. As daylight fades, the brain begins to produce melatonin, a hormone that promotes sleepiness. In the absence of artificial light, this process begins earlier and is more pronounced. Medieval people, living without electric lights, would have experienced a strong circadian rhythm that aligned closely with the natural cycle of day and night. By 5 or 6 in the evening, many households were already preparing for sleep. This might seem remarkably early by modern standards, but it made practical sense. There was a little point in staying awake in a cold, dark room when sleep offered both rest and a way to conserve body heat. But sleep in the medieval world was not the single, uninterrupted block that modern people often aim for. Instead, it followed a different pattern, one that historians and sleep researchers refer to as biphasic or segmented sleep. The household would go to bed shortly after dark, falling into what was called the first sleep. This period of rest lasted several hours, typically until around midnight or 1 in the morning. Then, without the aid of an alarm or any external signal, people would wake. This waking was not accidental. It was a natural part of the sleep cycle, a pause that occurred consistently night after night. And rather than trying to force themselves back to sleep immediately, medieval people used this time. The waking hours were quiet. The fire, if it had been banked properly, still held a dim glow beneath the couvre-feu. Someone might get up and add a small piece of wood to the coals, just enough to bring a little light back into the room. Others might remain in bed, lying awake in the darkness. This was a time for reflection, for prayer, for quiet conversation. Married couples might talk in low voices about the day's events or the plans for tomorrow. Individuals might lie still and think, processing the experiences of the day, worrying about the future, or simply letting their minds wander. Some people use this time for small tasks. A woman might get up and do a bit of spinning by the dim firelight. A man might check the animals, ensuring they were settled and warm. Children, if they woke, might be soothed back to sleep by a parent's quiet voice. There are historical records that refer to this waking period. Medieval prayer books include specific prayers meant to be said during the night, between the first and second sleep. Legal depositions from the period sometimes mention events that occurred after the first sleep, or before the second sleep, indicating that this pattern was common and widely understood. The waking period was not long, usually an hour or 2 at most. Then, gradually, sleep would return. People would settle back into their beds, pull the blankets closer, and drift into the second sleep. This second period of rest lasted until dawn, when the light began to return and the household stirred again. This biphasic pattern may seem strange to modern sensibilities, but it was likely the natural human sleep rhythm for most of history. It was only with the advent of artificial lighting, first candles and oil lamps on a larger scale, then gas lights, and finally electric lights, that sleep began to consolidate into a single block. The elimination of darkness eliminated the pause. For medieval people, the waking period was not a problem to be solved, it was simply part of the night. And in some ways it may have served important functions. The quiet, contemplative time allowed the mind to process emotions and experiences. It provided a space for intimacy between partners. It offered a moment of stillness in lives that were otherwise filled with labour. But the darkness during this waking period was profound. Even with a small fire burning, the room was dim. Shadows moved on the walls as the flames flickered. The space beyond the immediate glow of the hearth was black and featureless. In this darkness, sounds became more prominent. The creak of the wooden frame as it settled in the cold, the breathing of other people in the bed, the occasional shift of an animal in the barn section of the longhouse, the wind outside pressing against the shutters, finding the small gaps and whistling through. These sounds were familiar. They were the sounds of home, of safety. But they could also be unsettling. In the deep quiet of the night, every noise seemed louder, more significant. A sudden sound, a branch breaking under the weight of snow, a dog barking in the distance, could jolt someone awake, heart pounding until the source was identified and dismissed. Darkness also played tricks on the mind. Shapes seen at the edge of vision seemed to move. The mind, starved of visual input, began to fill in the gaps with imagination. This was the time when ghost stories felt most real, when the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world seemed most fragile. Children especially might be frightened during the waking hours. Parents would comfort them, reminding them that the fire was still burning, that the family was together, that the house was secure. The presence of other bodies, the sound of familiar breathing, the warmth under the blankets, these were reassurances that pushed back against the fear of the dark. Adults too might feel unease, but they had learned to manage it. They recited prayers, as mentioned earlier. They focused on practical thoughts, what needed to be done in the morning, how much firewood remained, whether the weather would allow for travel. They stayed grounded in the tangible, the known, the controllable, and then, as the second sleep approached, the mind would begin to drift again. Thoughts would slow, the body would relax. The darkness, which had seemed oppressive, became simply the absence of light, a neutral condition, neither good nor bad. The transition back into sleep was gentle. There was no sudden shift, no moment of decision. It simply happened. The breathing deepened, the muscles went slack, consciousness faded, and the household, having passed through the waking hours, entered the deepest part of the night, the second sleep, which would carry them through until dawn. Outside, the world remained cold and dark. Snow might be falling, the temperature might be dropping to its lowest point of the night. But inside, beneath the heavy wool, surrounded by the warmth of other bodies, sleep was possible. The darkness was not conquered, it was accepted. And in that acceptance there was a kind of peace. The pattern of waking in the middle of the night was so common in medieval Europe that it was woven into the structure of daily life. It was not an anomaly or a sleep disorder, it was simply how people slept. The first sleep began shortly after the fire was banked and the household had settled into bed. This usually occurred within an hour or two of sunset, meaning that in the depths of winter, people might be asleep by 6 or 7 in the evening. The first sleep was deep. The body, tired from a day of physical labour, fell quickly into rest. Breathing slowed, muscles relaxed. The cold air of the room was held at bay by the layers of wool and the warmth of other bodies in the shared bed. This period of sleep lasted for several hours, typically 3 to 5. Then, around midnight, or in the early hours of the morning, something shifted. The body's internal rhythms brought the sleeper back to the surface. Eyes opened. Awareness returned. This waking was not jarring. It was gentle, a natural surfacing from deep rest. The person might lie still for a few moments, orienting themselves, feeling the weight of the blankets, hearing the sounds of the house. Then, depending on their needs and habits, they might either remain in bed or get up for a short time. For those who remained in bed, the waking period was an opportunity for thought and quiet connection. Married couples often spoke during this time. The darkness provided privacy even in a shared sleeping space. Conversations were low and intimate, covering topics that might not be discussed during the busy daylight hours, concerns about children, worries about money, plans for the coming season. There are references in medieval literature to this nighttime conversation. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, characters speak of discussing matters between sleeps. In legal records, people sometimes mentioned events that occurred during the waking hours of the night, indicating that this was a recognised and accepted part of the daily rhythm. The waking period was also a time for prayer. many people, had been taught specific prayers to recite during the night. These were not elaborate or formal prayers, but simple, repetitive phrases that helped to calm the mind and reinforce a sense of spiritual protection. The repetition itself was soothing, a way to ease the transition back into sleep. For some, the waking hours were a time of mild activity. A person might rise from bed, moving carefully to avoid disturbing others, and tend to the fire. If the couvre-feu had been placed correctly, the coals beneath would still be warm. A small stick of kindling could be added, and with a bit of gentle blowing, a small flame could be coaxed back to life. This was not done to heat the room. By this hour, the interior temperature had already dropped significantly, and a small fire would do little to change that. Rather, it was done for light and for the comfort of seeing the fire alive again. The glow was reassuring. It pushed back the darkness just enough to make the room feel less oppressive. With the fire providing a small amount of light, other tasks became possible. Women sometimes used this time to spin wool. The rhythmic motion of the spindle, the feel of the fibre between the fingers, these were activities that required little concentration and could be done almost by touch. The work was meditative, a way to occupy the hands while the mind remained calm. Men might use the time to check on tools or to think through the next day's work. If livestock were kept in an attached barn or within the longhouse itself, someone might move quietly through the space, ensuring that the animals were settled and that no problems had arisen during the first part of the night. But these activities were quiet and brief. The waking period was not meant for productivity. It was a pause, a space between two halves of the night. There is evidence that this biphasic sleep pattern was not unique to medieval Europe. References to segmented sleep appear in writings from ancient Greece, from pre-industrial Japan, from indigenous cultures around the world. Wherever people lived without artificial light, the pattern seems to have been similar: sleep, wake, sleep again. Modern sleep researchers have studied this phenomenon. In experiments where participants were deprived of artificial light and allowed to sleep according to their natural rhythms, many began to adopt a biphasic pattern. After a few weeks, they would sleep for several hours, wake for an hour or two, and then return to sleep until morning. This suggests that the medieval sleep pattern was not culturally imposed, but biologically natural. The waking hours were not restless. People did not lie in bed worrying about falling back asleep. They did not see the waking as a failure or a problem. It was simply part of the night, as natural as the first sleep or the second, and when the body was ready, sleep returned. There was no forcing it. The eyelids grew heavy, thoughts became slower, less distinct. The person settled back into the warmth of the bed, adjusted the blankets, and let go. The second sleep was different from the first. It was lighter, more prone to dreams. People sometimes reported vivid dreams during the second sleep, full of images and emotions that lingered into the waking hours of the morning. These dreams were seen as significant, sometimes even prophetic. There was a belief that the mind, in the deep hours of the night, was more open to messages from the divine or from the spirit world. But whether the second sleep brought dreams or simply deep rest, it carried the household through to dawn. By the time the sky began to lighten, usually around 6 or 7 in the morning in winter, the body was ready to wake again. This final waking was different from the nighttime waking. It was active, purposeful. The day was beginning, and there was work to be done. Someone would rise from bed and uncover the fire. If the coals had been banked properly, they would still be alive, and the fire could be rebuilt quickly. Wood was added piece by piece, until the flames were strong enough to provide heat and light for the morning's tasks. The room, which had been cold and dark, began to warm. Others in the household stirred. Blankets were pulled aside, feet touched the cold floor. The day was starting. But the transition from sleep to wakefulness was gradual. There was no rush, no alarm demanding immediate action. People moved slowly, allowing their bodies to adjust to the temperature, to the light, to the shift from rest to activity. The two sleeps, separated by a period of quiet waking, had carried them through the long winter night. The pattern had been the same for generations, and it would continue for generations more, until the arrival of artificial light disrupted the rhythm and consolidated sleep into a single block. But in the medieval world, the two sleeps were simply how rest worked. They were part of the architecture of endurance, one more adaptation to a world shaped by darkness and cold, and they were enough. Light, in the medieval home, was measured not in watts or lumens, but in time and cost. Every source of illumination required resources, materials, labour, money. And so light was used sparingly, saved for the moments when it was truly needed. The primary source of light, of course, was the fire. During the day, when the fire was burning brightly to cook food or provide warmth, it also illuminated the space around the hearth. But as evening approached and the fire was allowed to die down to coals, that light diminished. For tasks that required more light than the banked fire could provide, people turned to other sources. The simplest and cheapest of these was the rushlight. A rushlight was made from the pith of a rush plant. Rushes grew abundantly in wetlands and along riverbanks, making them easy to harvest. The outer green skin of the rush was peeled away, leaving only the spongy white pith. This pith was then dried and dipped, repeatedly into rendered animal fat, usually tallow from sheep or cattle. The fat soaked into the pith, turning it into a slow-burning wick. When lit, the rushlight produced a small, flickering flame. The light was dim, barely enough to illuminate the immediate area around it, and it did not last long. A rushlight about 15 inches in length would burn for roughly 30 minutes before being consumed entirely. Rushlights were held in simple metal clips, often mounted on a stand or attached to a wall. The clip gripped the rush at an angle, allowing the lit end to burn downward, while the unburned portion remained supported. As the rush burned, it had to be adjusted periodically, moved up in the clip to keep the flame at the correct height. The light from a rushlight was smoky and uneven. The burning fat produced a distinct odour, not unpleasant exactly, but noticeable. The flame was also fragile, easily extinguished by a draught. Working by rushlight required patience and proximity. Fine work, sewing a seam, reading text, carving detail into wood, was difficult and often impractical. But rushlights were cheap. A household could make dozens of them from a single rendering of fat and a bundle of rushes. For the poorer, they were often the only source of artificial light available. Candles were better but more expensive. The most common type of candle was made from tallow, the same rendered animal fat used for rushlights. Tallow candles were formed by repeatedly dipping a wick, usually made of twisted linen or cotton, into melted fat. Each dip added a thin layer, and over many repetitions the candle grew to the desired thickness. Tallow candles burned brighter than rushlights and lasted longer. A well-made tallow candle could burn for several hours, providing steady light. But they had significant drawbacks. The burning tallow produced a thick, acrid smoke that irritated the eyes and lungs. The smell was strong and unpleasant, a greasy animal odour that clung to clothing and hair, and the candles produced a great deal of soot, which blackened walls and ceilings over time. Tallow candles also melted easily if placed too close to a heat source. The fat would soften, and the candle would bend or collapse. They had to be positioned carefully, away from the direct heat of the fire, but close enough to be useful. Despite these issues, tallow candles were widely used. They were affordable, at least for those with access to livestock. A household that slaughtered a pig or a sheep in the autumn could render the fat and make enough candles to last through the winter. For urban households without their own animals, candles could be purchased from chandlers, craftspeople who specialised in making candles and soap from tallow. But there was a better option, one that was reserved for the wealthy and the church: beeswax candles. Beeswax was a byproduct of honey production. When bees built their honeycombs, they secreted wax to form the structure of the comb. After the honey was harvested, the wax could be melted down, purified, and formed into candles. Beeswax candles were superior in every way. They burned with a clean, bright flame that produced almost no smoke. The scent was pleasant, sweet and faintly floral, reminiscent of the hive. The wax itself was firm and stable, not prone to melting or drooping, and beeswax candles burned slowly, lasting much longer than tallow candles of the same size. But beeswax was expensive. It required beekeeping, which was a specialised skill, and the amount of wax produced by a hive was limited. Most of the beeswax produced in medieval Europe went to the church, where it was used for altar candles and religious ceremonies. Secular use of beeswax candles was largely confined to the nobility and the very wealthy. For most people, beeswax candles were something seen only in churches, glowing on the altar during Mass. The light they cast was associated with sanctity, with purity, with the divine. To burn a beeswax candle at home would have been an extravagance beyond consideration. The scarcity of light shaped the rhythm of the day. Work that required good vision had to be done during daylight hours, near windows or outdoors. As the sun set and the natural light faded, activity shifted to those that could be done by feel or by the dim glow of the hearth. Reading, for instance, was a daytime activity for most people. Books were rare and valuable, and reading by candlelight or rushlight was difficult. The text was hard to see, the light was unsteady, and the risk of accidentally setting the pages on fire was real. Scholars and monks, who had access to better lighting and whose work required nighttime reading, often complained of eye strain and headaches. Sewing and embroidery, especially fine work, were also daytime tasks. The stitches had to be small and precise, and this required clear vision. Some women would sit near a window during the afternoon, taking advantage of the last hours of good light to complete detailed work. But there were tasks that could be done by firelight or candlelight. Spinning wool, as mentioned earlier, was one. Carding wool, combing the fibres to align them before spinning, was another. Both tasks relied more on touch than on sight, and both were common evening activities. Storytelling, of course, required no light at all. Families gathered near the fire and stories were told from memory. These were not just entertainment. They were education, cultural transmission, moral instruction. Children learned the values and history of their community through stories, and adults reinforced their own understanding of the world. Songs were sung, prayers were recited, conversations were held. All of this happened in the dim, flickering light of the hearth, with perhaps a single rushlight or candle to supplement the glow. The darkness itself became a presence in the room. It pressed in from the corners, filled the spaces between people, and made the small circle of light around the fire feel both comforting and fragile. Beyond the light, there was only shadow. Formless, unknowable, slightly threatening. This was why light, however dim, was so important. It was not just about visibility. It was about marking the human space, the safe space, within the larger darkness. The fire and the candle created a boundary. Inside that boundary, there was warmth, activity, life. Outside it, there was cold, stillness, uncertainty. When the evening's tasks were done and it was time to sleep, the light was extinguished. Candles were snuffed out, rushlights were allowed to burn down to nothing, and the fire was banked. The room was plunged into near total darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the covered coals. This darkness was absolute in a way that modern people rarely experience. There were no streetlights, no electric clocks, no glowing screens. The night was black and silent, and sleep was the only reasonable response. In the morning, the first task was to bring light back into the world. The coals were uncovered, wood was added, and the fire was rebuilt. As the flames grew, the room brightened. The darkness retreated. The day could begin. Light, in the medieval world, was precious because it was scarce. And because it was scarce, it was used with intention, saved for the moments when it was truly needed, and extinguished without hesitation when the time for rest arrived. The bed was not simply a place to sleep. It was a piece of technology, carefully designed to maximize warmth and minimize heat loss during the long, cold night. For most families, there was only one bed. This was not a sign of poverty, though the poor certainly had fewer resources to work with. It was simply the norm. Beds were expensive and took up a great deal of space. A single, large bed that could accommodate multiple people was more practical than several smaller ones. The construction of the bed began with its foundation. In the simplest peasant homes, this might be nothing more than a raised wooden platform built into the corner of the room. The platform was elevated to keep the sleepers off the cold, damp floor, and positioned near the hearth to take advantage of its residual warmth. On top of the platform, loose straw was spread. This straw served as insulation, creating a barrier between the sleepers and the hardwood below. The straw also had a small amount of springiness, providing a slight cushion. Over time, the straw would flatten and compact, and it would need to be replaced or refreshed. This was a regular household task, typically done in late autumn, when fresh straw was available from the grain harvest. Over the layer of loose straw, a mattress was placed. For most people, this was a large sack made of coarse linen or wool, stuffed with more straw or, if the household could afford it, hay. Hay was preferable because it was softer and less likely to poke through the fabric of the sack. The mattress was often referred to as a tick, and the phrase, "hit the hay," comes from the practice of punching the tick to fluff the straw inside before lying down. Wealthier households had mattresses filled with feathers or down, which provided much better insulation and comfort. But these were luxuries. For the majority of people, straw or hay was the standard filling. On top of the mattress came the bedding. Sheets, when they existed, were made of linen. Linen was preferred because it was smooth against the skin and could be washed, though washing was a laborious process and done infrequently. Many households, particularly poorer ones, did not have sheets at all. The sleepers lay directly on the mattress, with their wool clothing providing a barrier between their skin and the rough fabric. The real insulation came from the blankets. These were heavy wool, often layered several deep. Wool, as discussed earlier, was the ideal material for cold weather. It retained heat even when damp. It was naturally water resistant, and its fibres trapped air, creating an insulating layer around the body. The blankets were large enough to cover everyone in the bed. In a family bed, this might mean a single enormous blanket that stretched from one side to the other, or several blankets layered and overlapping. The weight of the wool itself was part of the design. Heavy blankets pressed down on the body, reducing the amount of air circulation under the covers and trapping the warmth generated by the sleepers. In colder regions or wealthier households, furs or sheepskins might be added. These provided additional warmth and a sense of luxury, though they were not strictly necessary for survival. The fleece side of a sheepskin could be placed against the body, providing a soft, warm surface that felt comfortable against the skin. Before getting into bed, the household took steps to pre-warm the sleeping space. Stones or bricks were heated in the fire for several hours, absorbing as much heat as possible. These were then wrapped in cloth, usually linen or wool, to prevent burns, and placed under the blankets in the spots where people's feet would rest. The heated stones did not stay warm all night. Within an hour or two, they would cool to the ambient temperature. But they served an important function. They took the initial chill out of the bed, making it comfortable to enter. Once the sleepers were under the blankets and their own body heat began to accumulate, the stones were no longer needed. In wealthier homes, a more sophisticated tool was used, the bed warmer. This was a metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals from the fire. The pan was passed back and forth under the blankets, warming the mattress and the inner layers of bedding. It was then removed and set aside before anyone got into bed, to avoid the risk of burns or fire. Once the bed was warmed and ready, the household climbed in. The arrangement of bodies was not random. It followed patterns based on age, gender, and social hierarchy. In a typical family bed, the parents slept in the centre. This was the warmest position, surrounded on both sides by the bodies of their children. The children were arranged by age, with the youngest closest to the mother and the oldest on the outer edges. This pattern had practical and cultural reasons. The young children, who generated less body heat and were more vulnerable to cold, benefited from being close to the adults. The older children, who were more resilient and generated more heat, could tolerate the slightly cooler positions on the edges. In some households, particularly in Northern Europe, the arrangement was slightly different. Mothers and daughters slept on one side, fathers and sons on the other. This division maintained a degree of modesty and social order, even within the intimate space of the shared bed. The shared bed was also a space where guests or servants might sleep. If a traveller sought shelter for the night, they might be invited to sleep in the family bed, especially during the coldest months. This was not seen as unusual or inappropriate. It was an act of charity and practical warmth sharing. The traveller contributed their body heat to the collective warmth of the bed, and in exchange they received shelter and safety. There was an etiquette to the shared bed. People slept in their undergarments, linen shifts for women, linen shirts for men. Outer clothing was removed and either hung on pegs or folded and placed at the foot of the bed to serve as additional blankets. Nightcaps were worn by everyone, regardless of age or gender, to prevent heat loss from the head. Movement during the night was discouraged. Shifting or rolling too much disturbed the others and disrupted the carefully maintained warmth under the blankets. Children were taught to lie still, and adults learned through habit to move as little as possible. The space under the blankets became a microclimate, warmer than the surrounding room by several degrees. The combined body heat of multiple people trapped by the heavy wool created a pocket of relative comfort. The breath of the sleepers added moisture to the air under the blankets, which also helped to retain warmth. But the shared bed was not without its challenges. The close proximity of bodies meant that any illness could spread quickly. If one person had a cough or a fever, the others in the bed were likely to contract it as well. Privacy was minimal. Snoring, restless movements, and bodily functions were all experienced collectively. Yet the shared bed was also a source of emotional comfort. The physical closeness reinforced family bonds. Children felt safe surrounded by their parents and siblings. Adults found reassurance in the presence of others during the vulnerable hours of sleep. In wealthier homes, the bed was often enclosed with curtains. These curtains hung from a wooden frame or canopy and could be drawn closed, creating a small, tent-like space within the larger room. The curtains served multiple purposes. They provided privacy, which was valuable in households where servants or other members of the extended family might be sleeping nearby. They also blocked drafts, trapping even more warmth within the enclosed space. The bed curtains were usually made of heavy wool or linen, sometimes dyed in rich colours or embroidered with decorative patterns. For the very wealthy, the bed curtains were a display of status as much as a practical tool. But even in less affluent homes, simple curtains might be used during the coldest months to improve warmth retention. The bed, then, was not just furniture. It was a survival system. Every layer, from the loose straw on the bottom to the heavy wool blankets on top, served a specific purpose. And the people who slept in it were not just occupants. They were participants, contributing their own body heat to the collective warmth that made sleep possible. In the deep cold of a medieval winter, the shared bed was a fortress. Small, enclosed and filled with the warmth of human bodies, it turned the freezing night into something endurable. And when morning came, the household would emerge from beneath the blankets, one by one, leaving the small warmth of the bed and stepping back into the cold air of the room, ready to begin another day. The arrangement of bodies in the shared bed was not arbitrary. It followed patterns that had been refined over generations, patterns that balanced warmth, modesty, and social order. The most common arrangement, as mentioned, placed parents in the centre, with children distributed on either side. But the specifics of this arrangement varied depending on the size of the family, the age of the children, and the customs of the region. Infants and very young children slept closest to their mothers. This proximity served multiple purposes. The mother's body heat helped keep the infant warm. Her presence provided comfort if the child woke during the night. And the closeness made nighttime feeding easier, as nursing mothers could tend to their infants without fully waking or leaving the warmth of the bed. But this arrangement also carried risks. In crowded beds, there was always the danger that an adult might roll onto a small child during sleep, causing injury or suffocation. This was known as overlaying, and it was a recognised cause of infant death in the medieval period. Church records and legal documents include references to such accidents, and there were attempts to prevent them through the use of wooden cradles or special protective frames that kept the infants separate while still allowing them to share the bed's warmth. Some households used a different solution, the arcuccio. This was a curved wooden frame, somewhat like a half-barrel, that fit over the infant in the bed. The frame protected the child from being crushed while still allowing the warmth from the adults to circulate into the protected space. The arcuccio was particularly common in Italy, though similar devices appeared throughout Europe under different names. Older children, typically those past the age of 5 or 6, were positioned toward the edges of the bed. They were old enough to regulate their own body temperature more effectively and less vulnerable to being crushed. The outer positions were also slightly cooler, but the children's own body heat, combined with the warmth radiating from the centre of the bed, kept them comfortable. In larger families where the bed was particularly crowded, children might sleep at the foot of the bed, lying perpendicular to the adults. This arrangement maximised the number of people who could fit while still allowing everyone to benefit from shared warmth. It was not the most comfortable position, but it was functional. In households where the family included adolescent or adult children, the sleeping arrangement became more complex. Modesty and propriety required that grown children of opposite sexes be separated. In some cases, this meant that older sons would sleep in a separate area, perhaps in a loft above the main room or on a simple straw pallet on the floor near the fire. Daughters might remain in the main bed with their parents, or they might share a smaller bed in a different part of the house if space allowed. Servants, if the household employed them, usually slept separately from the family. In wealthier homes, servants might have their own quarters, often in an outbuilding or in a section of the main house set aside for their use. In more modest households, servants might sleep on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in cloaks or blankets, taking advantage of the residual heat from the banked fire. But during the coldest nights, these social boundaries could be relaxed. Survival took precedence over propriety. A servant might be invited into the family bed, or the family might join the servant near the fire, creating a larger collective sleeping arrangement. The goal was always the same, to maximise shared body heat and minimise exposure to the cold. The shared bed also extended beyond the immediate family. Travellers, as previously noted, might be invited to share the bed. This was considered a basic act of hospitality, particularly in rural areas where inns were scarce. To turn away a traveller on a freezing night was not only unkind, but potentially fatal. The traveller brought their own body heat into the bed, benefiting everyone, and in exchange they received shelter and warmth. There were, of course, social conventions governing this practice. Travellers were typically placed at the edge of the bed, not in the centre where the family members slept. Men and women who were not married to each other were kept separated, with family members positioned between them. These arrangements maintained a degree of propriety, while still allowing for the practical benefits of shared warmth. Historical records include accounts of travellers sharing beds with strangers in this manner. In his journals, the medieval scholar and traveller Peter Abelard mentions sleeping in communal beds at monasteries and inns, noting that the practice was both common and unremarkable. Legal depositions from the period sometimes reference events that occurred while sharing a bed with others, indicating that this was a normal part of medieval life. The order of entry into the bed also followed patterns. Typically, the youngest children were put to bed first. They were settled under the blankets, arranged in their designated positions, and given time to warm the sleeping space with their body heat. Then the older children would climb in, followed by the adults. This sequence ensured that the bed was already warm by the time everyone was in place. It also meant that the children, who needed more sleep than adults, were already resting by the time the parents finished their evening tasks and were ready to retire, exiting the bed in the morning. Followed a similar order but in reverse. The adults rose first, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the sleeping children. They would rekindle the fire, dress, and begin the day's work while the children continued to sleep in the still warm bed. As the room gradually warmed from the rebuilt fire, the children would wake naturally and join the adults. This staggered rising made practical sense. The adults needed to start the fire and prepare the morning meal, tasks that required them to be awake and active. The children, who contributed less to these early tasks, could remain in the warm bed until the room was more comfortable. But the shared bed was not only a physical arrangement, it was also a social and emotional space. The closeness of the sleeping arrangement meant that family members were keenly aware of each other's presence. A child who woke frightened during the night could hear the steady breathing of their parents and siblings, a reassurance that they were not alone. A parent who woke during the night could check by touch and sound that all their children were safe and well. Conversations that might not happen during the busy daylight hours could take place in the darkness of the bed. Parents might speak quietly to each other after the children had fallen asleep, discussing concerns or making plans. Older children might whisper to their siblings, sharing secrets or simply talking in the way that children do when they are supposed to be asleep but are not quite ready to let go of the day. There was also a spiritual dimension to the shared bed. Prayers were often said together before sleep. A parent might lead the children in a simple prayer, asking for protection through the night. The act of praying together in the intimate darkness of the bed reinforced both religious faith and family bonds. The bed was also the place where people died. In an era when most people died at home rather than in hospitals, the shared bed was often the deathbed. Family members would gather around, keeping vigil, offering comfort. The bed, which had been a place of rest and warmth throughout life, became the place of final rest. This association between the bed and death was not morbid. It was simply realistic. The bed was where life's most vulnerable moments occurred: birth, illness, death, and the family was present for all of them. But for most of the year, for most people, the bed was simply the place where they slept. It was where the body rested, where warmth was shared, where the long winter night was endured. The order of the bed, who slept where, in what arrangement, following what patterns, was part of the larger architecture of survival. Like the layers of the walls, the banking of the fire, and the careful management of food stores, the arrangement of the bed was a strategy designed to conserve warmth and sustain life through the cold months. And it worked. Night after night through the depth of winter, families climbed into their shared beds, arranged themselves according to familiar patterns, and slept. The cold remained outside. The warmth remained within, and morning always came. In many parts of medieval Europe, the boundary between human living space and animal shelter was not a wall but a low partition, a change in floor level, or sometimes nothing more than an understanding of where one area ended and another began. This cohabitation was not universal. In southern Europe, where winters were milder, animals were more likely to be housed in separate buildings. But in the north, in Scandinavia, Scotland, parts of Germany, and the upland regions of England, the practice of bringing animals indoors during winter was common and practical. The structure that enabled this practice was the longhouse. These buildings were rectangular, sometimes as much as 60 or 70 feet in length, with the human living quarters at one end and the animal byre at the other. The two sections were separated by a partition or a step down in the floor level, but they shared the same roof and, critically, the same airspace. The animals kept in the byre varied depending on the resources of the household. Cattle were the most valuable. A single cow provided milk throughout much of the year, and that milk could be turned into butter and cheese. Cows were expensive to acquire and expensive to feed, so they were protected carefully. During winter, when fodder was scarce and the cold could weaken or kill livestock, bringing the cows indoors made economic sense. Sheep were also commonly housed inside. Like cattle, they were valuable for their ongoing production, in their case, wool. A sheep could be sheared every year, providing fibre for clothing and blankets, and unlike cattle, sheep were relatively small and could be kept in larger numbers within the same space. Pigs were housed inside as well, though they presented different challenges. Pigs were omnivorous and would eat almost anything, which made them useful for consuming household scraps, but they were also loud, messy, and prone to rooting through anything not secured. Still, the value of a pig, particularly the fat it provided when slaughtered, justified the inconvenience. Chickens and other fowl might be kept in a separate coop within the byre, or allowed to roost in the rafters. Goats, in regions where they were common, would also be brought inside. The primary reason for this arrangement was the warmth the animals produced. A large animal like a cow generates a significant amount of body heat, comparable to a small space heater running continuously. Sheep, though smaller, still radiate warmth. When multiple animals are confined in a relatively small space, the cumulative heat is substantial. This heat did not stay confined to the byre. The air in the longhouse circulated naturally. Warm air from the animal section rose and moved toward the human living area. Cold air from the human section sank and flowed back. Toward the animals, this circulation created a thermal gradient that benefited both sections. Experimental archaeology has tested this principle. Researchers built replica longhouses using medieval construction techniques and housed livestock in one end during winter. Temperature measurements showed that the presence of animals could raise the interior temperature of the human living area by several degrees, enough to make a meaningful difference in comfort and survivability. In a Scandinavian winter, for instance, where exterior temperatures might drop to -20 degrees Celsius or lower, an unheated longhouse would quickly approach the same temperature. But with livestock inside and a banked fire in the hearth, the interior could be maintained at around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. This is still cold by modern standards, but it is manageable if one is dressed in heavy wool and moving about periodically. The animals also benefited from the arrangement. The shared warmth of the building kept them from freezing, and the protection from wind and snow reduced the stress on their bodies. Livestock that were kept outside during harsh winters often lost weight, stopped producing milk, or died outright. Those kept indoors fared much better. But the cohabitation created a sensory environment that was far from pleasant by modern standards. The smell of animals, their bodies, their breath, their waste filled the house. Cattle and sheep produced large amounts of manure, and while efforts were made to keep the byre section clean, the odour was persistent and pervasive. The animals were noisy, cattle lowed, sometimes loudly, particularly if they were hungry or restless. Sheep bleated. Pigs grunted and squealed. Chickens clucked and squawked. During the night, these sounds were part of the background of sleep, familiar enough that they rarely woke the household, but present nonetheless. The air in the longhouse was thick with moisture. Animals, like humans, exhale water vapour. In a confined space with limited ventilation, this moisture accumulated, creating a damp atmosphere that clung to walls and bedding. Combined with the smoke from the hearth and the odours from the byre, the air quality was poor. Yet the people who lived in longhouses did not see this environment as intolerable. It was simply how things were. The smells and sounds of the animals were markers of home, of security, of survival. A house without animals was a house without resources, without the means to endure the winter. The presence of livestock was a reassurance, a sign that the household was prepared. There was also a practical rhythm to the day dictated by the animals' needs. Cows had to be milked twice daily, regardless of the weather or the household's other tasks. This meant that someone had to rise early, move into the byre, and spend time with the animals while the rest of the household was still in bed. Feeding the animals was another daily task. Hay and straw, stored in a loft above the byre or in a separate building, had to be brought down and distributed. Water had to be provided, though in winter this often meant breaking through ice that had formed overnight in the water trough. The animals' waste had to be managed. In some longhouses there was a drainage channel that allowed liquids to flow out of the byre into a pit or gutter outside. Solid waste was removed periodically, usually by shoveling it out through a door at the animal end of the building. This manure was not discarded but saved. It was composted and later spread on fields to fertilise the soil for the next growing season. The work of maintaining the animals was constant, but it was also grounding. The daily routine of feeding, milking and cleaning created a structure that carried the household through the long, dark months. There was always something that needed to be done. Always a reason to get up and move, even on the coldest mornings. The relationship between humans and their livestock in this context was intimate. The animals were not kept at a distance. They were part of the household's daily life, their sounds and smells and presence as familiar as the members of the family itself. Children grew up with this proximity. They learned to recognise individual animals, to understand their behaviours and temperaments. A child might have a favourite cow, a sheep they had helped to birth, a pig they had raised from a piglet. These animals were not pets in the modern sense. They were working animals, resources to be used. But there was still a connection, a recognition of the animal as a living being with its own personality. When an animal was slaughtered, it was a significant event. Pigs were usually killed in late autumn or early winter, before the cold became too severe. The slaughter provided fresh meat for a brief period, but more importantly, it provided fat for rendering into lard and materials for preservation. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted. The slaughter of a cow or a sheep was less common, reserved for situations where the animal was too old, too sick, or when the household desperately needed the resources the animal could provide. Dairy cows and wool-producing sheep were too valuable to slaughter unless absolutely necessary. The animals in the longhouse were not merely sources of warmth. They were integral to the household's economy, its food supply, its ability to produce clothing and trade goods. But during the winter, when their productive capacity was limited and their survival was uncertain, their role as living heaters became paramount. Dogs, too, were part of the household. They were not usually kept in the byre but lived in the human section of the longhouse, or were allowed to come and go as needed. Dogs served as guards, alerting the household to intruders or predators. They also provided companionship and a small amount of warmth if they slept near or on the bed. In some regions, dogs were even kept on the roof of the house. The turf roofs common in Scandinavia and other northern areas provided enough stability for a dog to walk on, and the animal's presence there served as an early warning system. A dog barking on the roof would wake the household, giving them time to respond to whatever threat had disturbed the animal. Cats were less common, but not unknown. They served a practical purpose, controlling the rodent population that was drawn to stored grain and other food supplies. A household with significant grain stores needed cats to prevent mice and rats from consuming or contaminating the food. Cats were tolerated rather than loved, but their contribution to the household's survival was real. The medieval longhouse, with its humans and animals sharing the same space, was a fundamentally different conception of home than what most modern people experience. The boundaries between species were permeable. The air, the warmth, the sounds, the smells, all were shared. It was not a comfortable arrangement by contemporary standards, but it was effective. The animals provided warmth that would have been impossible to generate through fire alone, and in exchange they received shelter and care that kept them alive through the harshest months. The longhouse was a collaborative space, a place where humans and animals worked together, however inadvertently, to survive the winter. And when spring finally came and the animals could be turned out to pasture again, the house could be cleaned, aired, and returned to a less crowded, less odorous state. But through the winter, the animals were essential. Their warmth was part of the architecture of endurance, as necessary as the thick walls, the banked fire, and the shared bed. The medieval home in winter was defined not only by what could be seen, but by what could be heard, smelled, and felt. These sensory experiences were constant, pervasive, and deeply familiar to those who lived within them. Sound was everywhere. During the day, the sounds of work filled the space, the rhythmic thump of a spindle, the scrape of a knife against wood, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of voices in conversation. But at night, the soundscape changed. As the household settled into sleep, the human sounds quieted. Conversations ceased, movement slowed, but the house itself was never silent. The timber frame creaked and groaned as the temperature dropped. Wood contracting cold, and the beams and posts of the house would shift slightly, producing low groans or sharp cracks that could startle someone on the edge of sleep. These were not signs of danger. They were simply the house adjusting to the cold, but to someone unfamiliar with the sounds, they could be unsettling. The wind was another constant presence. It pressed against the walls, found gaps in the shutters, and whistled through the thatch. On particularly stormy nights, the wind could be loud enough to make conversation difficult. It howled and moaned, creating a sense of wildness just beyond the fragile barrier of the walls. The animals, if they were housed in an attached byre, contributed their own sounds. The deep, resonant lowing of cattle, the softer bleating of sheep, the occasional grunt of a pig. These sounds were irregular but persistent, part of the background texture of the night. A household that lived with animals learned to distinguish between normal sounds and sounds that indicated a problem. A distressed animal, a predator attempting to enter the byre, a roof leak that was disturbing the livestock. Dogs barked periodically, responding to sounds or scents that humans could not detect. This barking served a function. It warned of approaching strangers or animals. It marked the boundary of the household's territory. And it provided a sense of security, a reminder that the dog was awake and alert even when the humans were not. The fire, even when banked, produced sounds. The coals shifted occasionally, settling as they burned down. A piece of wood that had not been fully consumed might crack or pop, releasing trapped moisture as steam. These were small sounds, barely audible, but in the quiet of the night they could be noticed. Human sounds were also part of the nighttime landscape. Breathing, of course, was constant. The rhythm of multiple people breathing in a shared bed created a gentle, repetitive sound that could be soothing. Snoring was common, and each person had their own pattern and volume. Some snored softly, a gentle rasp. Others snored loudly enough to disturb the entire household. Coughing was frequent, particularly in the smoky environment of the medieval home. Respiratory ailments were common, and the irritation from smoke made coughing worse. A household member with a persistent cough could disrupt sleep for everyone. Children sometimes cried or talked in their sleep. Adults might do the same. The quiet murmurs of sleep talking, the sudden cry from a nightmare. These were familiar and usually ignored unless the disturbance persisted. Smell was equally pervasive. The medieval home had a distinct olfactory signature, a combination of scents that would be immediately recognisable to anyone who lived there but might be overwhelming to a modern visitor. Smoke was the dominant scent. Wood smoke permeated everything. The walls, the bedding, the clothing, even the food. It was not an unpleasant smell exactly, but it was strong and inescapable. People who lived in smoky environments became accustomed to it, but visitors sometimes remarked on how strongly a household smelled of fire. The animals, of course, contributed their own odours. The musky, warm smell of cattle, the lanolin scent of sheep, the sharper, more pungent smell of pig manure. These smells were strongest in the byre section of the longhouse, but permeated the entire structure. Cooking smells mixed with the smoke and the animal odours. Pottage simmering over the fire released. The scent of onions, cabbage and whatever else had been added to the pot. Bread baking in the ashes gave off a yeasty, toasted smell. Meat roasting, when it was available, produced a rich, fatty aroma. Human bodies also contributed to the sensory environment. Bathing was infrequent, particularly in winter when heating water was difficult, and exposing the body to cold air was dangerous. Sweat, dirt, and the natural oils of the skin accumulated. Woolen clothing, worn for days or weeks at a time, absorbed these odours. But these smells were not perceived as offensive by those who lived with them. They were simply the smells of life, of home. A house that smelled of smoke and animals and cooking was a house that was inhabited, that was functioning, that was providing shelter and warmth. The absence of these smells might have been more disturbing than their presence. Touch was another constant sensory experience. The textures of the medieval home were distinct and varied. The rough weave of wool against skin, the smoothness of worn wood, the prickle of straw through a linen mattress cover, the cold, hard surface of a stone floor, or the slightly yielding surface of packed earth. Temperature was felt acutely. Near the fire the air was warm, almost hot. A few feet away it was cool. In the corners of the room, far from the hearth, it was cold. The body learned to navigate these temperature zones, seeking warmth when needed, moving away when the heat became too intense. The contrast between the warmth under the blankets and the cold air of the room was dramatic. Emerging from bed in the morning meant transitioning from a warm, enclosed space into the chill of the room. The shock of cold air on the face was a daily experience, one that required mental preparation. Drafts were felt as distinct currents of cold air. A draft from a poorly fitted shutter would create a stream of cold that could be felt on the skin, even through layers of clothing. People learned to position themselves to avoid drafts or to block them with their bodies or with furniture. The tactile experience of work was also significant. Hands became rough from labour. The wool spinner felt the texture of the fibre constantly, learning to judge its quality by touch. The person tending the fire felt the heat on their face and hands, learning how close they could get without burning themselves. These sensory experiences, sound, smell, touch, temperature, were not incidental details. They were the fabric of daily life. They created a sense of place, of familiarity, of home. A person could wake in the dark and know exactly where they were by the sounds they heard, the smells they detected, the feel of the blanket against their skin. This sensory familiarity also provided comfort. In the uncertainty of the medieval world, where so much was beyond human control, the predictable sensory landscape of the home was an anchor. It was a known quantity, a place where the body could relax and the mind could rest. But the sensory environment could also be overwhelming. The constant noise, the pervasive smells, the lack of privacy, these could wear on people, particularly during the long confinement of winter, when it was difficult to escape the enclosed space of the house. Some people sought moments of solitude, stepping outside briefly even in cold weather just to experience silence and fresh air. Others found solace in small rituals, a moment of prayer, a few minutes sitting by the fire alone, a walk to the well or the wood store that provided a break from the crowded interior. The sensory landscape of the medieval home was also a marker of social status. Wealthier homes had fewer animals, if any, living inside. The air was clearer, the smells less intense. Beeswax candles instead of tallow meant a sweeter scent. Finer textiles meant softer textures against the skin. But even in the wealthiest households, the sensory experience of winter was shaped by the same fundamental realities. The cold, the darkness, the need for fire and warmth. The differences were of degree, not of kind. The medieval home in winter was not a quiet, neutral space. It was loud, smelly, textured, and alive. It was a place where the senses were constantly engaged, where the body was always receiving information about temperature, safety, and the presence of others. And for the people who lived there, this was normal. It was home. The sounds of the animals, the smell of the smoke, the feel of the wool blanket. These were not inconveniences to be endured, but markers of survival, signs that the household was functioning and that life was continuing despite the cold outside. The sensory landscape of home was part of the architecture of endurance. It was one more layer of adaptation, one more way that medieval people learned to live within the constraints of their environment. And when spring came and the shutters could be opened and the animals turned out to pasture, the sensory landscape would change again. The house would grow quieter, fresher, brighter. But through the winter, the dense, rich, overwhelming sensory experience of the medieval home was what made survival possible. Clothing in the medieval world was not fashion, it was survival technology. Every garment, every layer, every stitch served a purpose: to trap warmth, to block wind, to manage moisture, to protect the body from the cold that could kill. The foundation of the medieval winter wardrobe was wool. This was not a matter of preference or tradition alone. Wool had specific physical properties that made it uniquely suited to cold, damp climates. The fibres of wool are naturally crimped, creating a structure full of tiny air pockets. These air pockets trap body heat, preventing it from escaping into the environment. The more air pockets, the better the insulation. This is why wool garments feel warm even when they are relatively thin. Wool fibres are also coated with lanolin, a waxy substance produced by sheep. Lanolin is hydrophobic, meaning it repels water. When wool gets wet, the water beads on the surface of the fibres rather than soaking in. This makes wool naturally water resistant, a critical quality in the rainy, snowy climates of northern Europe. But what truly sets wool apart is its ability to retain warmth even when damp. Most materials, when wet, lose their insulating properties. Wet cotton, for instance, clings to the skin and pulls heat away from the body. Wet wool, by contrast, continues to trap air within its fibres and continues to insulate. A person wearing wet wool will be uncomfortable, but they will not freeze as quickly as someone wearing wet linen or leather. Medieval people understood these properties through experience. They knew that wool kept them warm in the rain, that it dried relatively quickly when hung near the fire, and that it was durable enough to last for years if cared for properly. The production of wool was a communal effort. Sheep were sheared in late spring or early summer, when the weather was warm enough that the loss of their fleece would not endanger them. The wool was then cleaned, removing dirt and debris, and sometimes washed to remove excess lanolin, though some lanolin was often left in to maintain the wool's water resistance. After cleaning, the wool was carded, combed with wooden paddles set with metal teeth to align the fibres and remove tangles. Carding was labour-intensive and usually done by women and children during the quieter months of the agricultural calendar. The carded wool was then spun into thread using a spindle or, in later periods, a spinning wheel. Spinning was one of the most common tasks in medieval households. It could be done while sitting, while walking, while tending children. Women carried their spindles with them and spun whenever there was a free moment. The spun thread was woven into cloth on a loom. Weaving required more space and equipment than spinning, so it was often done by specialists or in households with the resources to maintain a loom. But in many rural areas, weaving was still a household task, particularly for producing the coarse wool cloth used for everyday garments. The resulting fabric varied in quality. Coarse wool, made from the outer fibres of the sheep's fleece, was rough and scratchy but durable and warm. It was used for the clothing of peasants and labourers. Fine wool, made from the softer undercoat, was smoother and more comfortable. It could be woven tightly to create a dense fabric that was both warm and windproof. Wealthier households and professional weavers produced a fabric called broadcloth. This was wool that had been woven tightly and then fulled, a process of beating and washing the fabric to mat the fibres together. Fulling made the cloth denser, more water-resistant and more windproof. Broadcloth was the premium wool fabric of the medieval period, expensive but highly effective. The garments made from wool were layered. Layering was essential because it created multiple air gaps, each one trapping additional warmth. The base layer worn directly against the skin was not wool but linen. Linen is made from flax fibres, and unlike wool, it absorbs moisture readily. This makes it ideal for undergarments because it wicks sweat away from the skin, keeping the body dry. A dry body stays warmer than a damp one, so the linen undergarment served an important function, even though it provided little insulation on its own. For women, the base layer was a long linen shift, sometimes called a chemise. It reached to the ankles and had long sleeves. For men, it was a linen shirt, also long-sleeved, reaching to mid-thigh or the knees. Over the linen base layer came the wool. For men, this was typically a tunic, also called a coat-hardie. The tunic was a simple garment, cut from a rectangular piece of cloth with holes for the head and arms. It reached to the knees or slightly below and was belted at the waist. In winter, the tunic was made of heavy wool, and it fit relatively closely to the body to reduce drafts. Women wore a similar wool tunic or gown over their linen shift. The gown was longer, reaching to the ankles, and often had tighter sleeves to prevent cold air from entering at the wrists. Both men and women wore hose, wool leg coverings that extended from the feet to the upper thighs. Hose were held up with ties or garters and provided insulation for the legs, which were particularly vulnerable to cold. In some cases, the hose had leather soles attached, allowing them to function as both legwear and indoor footwear. Over the tunic came the outer layer, designed to block wind and provide additional warmth. For most people, this was a cloak. Cloaks were large, rectangular or semicircular pieces of wool, often made from milled or fulled fabric to increase their wind resistance. The cloak was fastened at the shoulder or neck with a pin or brooch, and it could be wrapped tightly around the body to seal in warmth. In very cold weather, or for people who could afford it, the cloak might be lined with fur. Fur provided an additional layer of insulation and a barrier against wind. But fur was expensive, and its use was often restricted by sumptuary laws, legal codes that dictated what types of clothing and materials different social classes were allowed to wear. Royalty and the highest nobility wore ermine or sable, furs that were rare, expensive, and associated with status. Lesser nobility might wear marten or fox. Common people, if they used fur at all, lined their cloaks with rabbit, lambskin, or even cat pelts. These were not as luxurious, but they were warm and accessible. The head and extremities required special attention. A significant amount of body heat is lost through the scalp, so covering the head was essential. Both men and women wore hoods. The hood, called a guggle, covered the head, neck, and often the shoulders. It could be pulled tight, around the face, leaving only a small opening for the eyes and nose. In the coldest weather, the hood might be lined with fur or have an extra layer of wool sewn into the lining. This created a warm pocket of air around the head and protected the face from frostbite. Hands were covered with mittens rather than gloves. Mittens, which allow the fingers to share warmth, are significantly more effective at keeping hands warm than gloves, which separate the fingers and increase heat loss. Medieval mittens were made of wool or leather, sometimes lined with fur. Feet were more difficult to protect. Shoes were made of leather, which provided some protection from the wet but little insulation. To keep feet warm, people wore multiple layers of wool hose or wrapped their feet in cloth before putting on their shoes. Inside the house, many people wore only their hose with leather soles, avoiding the expense and wear of outdoor shoes. The care of these garments was important. Wool could be washed, but the process was labour-intensive. Garments were soaked in water, often with lye or urine to help break down oils and dirt, then beaten and rinsed. Washing removed some of the lanolin, reducing the wool's water resistance, so it was done sparingly. More often, wool garments were aired. They were hung outside or near the fire to dry, and the movement of air helped to remove odours and moisture. Sunlight, when available, also helped to freshen the fabric. Small repairs were made as needed. A torn seam was stitched. A hole was patched. Garments were valuable, and they were maintained for as long as possible. When a garment was finally too worn to repair, the fabric might be cut down and reused for smaller items, a child's tunic, a patch for another garment, or rags for cleaning. The layering of wool over linen, the use of cloaks and hoods, the careful attention to covering the extremities, all of this was part of a system designed to create a microclimate around the body. Each layer trapped air. Each gap was sealed. The body became its own furnace, generating heat through metabolism and trapping that heat within the layers of fabric. This system was effective. A person dressed in wool layers could survive and work in temperatures well below freezing. They would be cold, certainly, but they would not freeze. The wool would protect them, allowing them to move, to labour, to tend animals, to gather firewood, all the tasks necessary for survival. The architecture of wool was not just about the garments themselves. It was about understanding how the body loses heat and designing clothing to prevent that loss. It was about using the materials available, sheep's wool, flax, leather, animal furs, in the most effective way possible, and it worked. Through the coldest winters, through snow and rain and wind, medieval people survived because they had learned to build their warmth one layer at a time. Dressing for a medieval winter was not a quick process. It was deliberate, methodical, and essential to survival. The first step upon waking was often to remain under the blankets for as long as possible. The bed was warm, the room was cold. The transition between the two required both physical and mental preparation. When it was finally time to rise, the first garment put on was the linen undergarment, the shift for women, the shirt for men. This had usually been slept in, so it was already on the body. Sleeping in the linen base layer was practical. It provided a small amount of warmth during the night, and it meant one less garment to put on in the cold morning air. Next came the hose. These were pulled on while still sitting in bed, if possible, to minimise exposure to the cold floor. The hose were tied or gartered at the thigh to keep them from slipping down. For men, the hose attached to the waistband of the braise, a simple undergarment similar to shorts. For women, the hose were tied directly to a belt worn under the gown. With the legs covered, the next layer was the wool tunic or gown. This was pulled over the head and adjusted so that it hung properly. The tunic was belted at the waist, both to keep it in place and to create a bloused effect that trapped additional air around the torso. Over the tunic, additional layers might be added depending on the temperature and the day's activities. A second tunic, slightly larger than the first, could be worn for extra warmth. A sleeveless surcoat, a simple wool garment worn over the tunic, provided another layer of insulation without restricting arm movement. The cloak was added last, before going outside or before sitting down to work in a particularly cold area of the house. The cloak was fastened at the shoulder or throat, and arranged so that it covered the back and sides, with the front edges overlapping to seal in warmth. The hood was pulled up and adjusted to cover the head and neck. On very cold days, the hood might be wrapped around the face, leaving only the eyes exposed. Mittens were put on if work needed to be done outside or if the hands were particularly cold. Inside the house, most people kept their hands free to allow for finer tasks, relying on the warmth of the fire and frequent warming breaks to keep their fingers functional. This layering system was not rigid. People adjusted their clothing throughout the day based on their activity level and the temperature. Someone doing heavy physical labour, chopping wood for instance, might remove their cloak and even their outer tunic to avoid overheating. The wool would wick away moisture to some degree, but excessive sweating was dangerous. Damp clothing lost its insulating properties, and a person who had worked up a sweat could become dangerously cold once they stopped moving. So the layers were added and removed as needed. This required awareness of the body's signals, the first feeling of chill, the first sign of sweat, and quick adjustments to prevent either freezing or overheating. Children required help with layering. A mother would dress her children in the morning, ensuring that each layer was in place and that the garments fit properly. Children grew quickly, and their clothing had to be adjusted or replaced regularly. Younger children wore simplified versions of adult clothing, smaller tunics, shorter cloaks, but the principles were the same. Infants were wrapped in layers of linen and wool bundled tightly to conserve heat. Swaddling, which involved wrapping the infant snugly in long strips of cloth, was common. This kept the baby warm and, it was believed, helped the limbs to grow straight. Swaddled infants could be held easily, carried in a sling, or placed near the fire without risk of them crawling into danger. The elderly also needed additional help with dressing. Stiff joints made it difficult to pull on hose or to fasten a cloak. Family members assisted, ensuring that the older members of the household were properly dressed and warm. The process of layering was also gendered. Men's clothing was designed to allow for physical labour. Tunics were shorter, ending at the knee, to allow for easier movement. Hose were sturdy and thick. Cloaks could be thrown back over the shoulders when work required full use of the arms. Women's clothing was longer and more enclosing. Gowns reached to the ankles, and cloaks were often larger and more enveloping. This was partly a matter of modesty, as social norms dictated that women's bodies be more fully covered, but it was also practical. Women's work in winter, spinning, cooking, tending children, was often done indoors or in less physically demanding contexts, so the longer garments did not hinder movement as much as they might have for men doing heavy labour. Pregnant women faced additional challenges. As the pregnancy progressed, standard clothing no longer fit. Gowns were let out at the seams, or larger garments were borrowed from other women. Cloaks, being loose and draped, could accommodate the changing body more easily. But the extra weight and the body's increased metabolic demands meant that pregnant women often felt colder than usual, requiring additional layers. The nobility had access to finer materials and more layers. A nobleman might wear a linen shirt, a wool tunic, a padded gambeson for additional warmth, a surcoat and a fur-lined cloak. Each layer was of higher quality than what a peasant could afford. The wool more tightly woven, the linen finer, the fur more luxurious. But the principles were the same. Warmth was built layer by layer, air was trapped between the layers, and the body was protected from wind and cold. The care required to maintain these layers was significant. Each garment had to be checked regularly for damage. A small tear could grow larger if not repaired, and a gap in the clothing was a pathway for cold air. Wool garments, particularly cloaks and outer tunics, collected dirt and debris. They were brushed or beaten to remove surface dirt. Stains were scrubbed with water and soap, though this was done sparingly to preserve the fabric. Linen undergarments, being in direct contact with the skin, required more frequent washing. These garments absorbed sweat and body oils, and if left unwashed for too long, they became stiff and uncomfortable. But washing in winter was difficult. Water had to be heated, which required fuel and time. Wet garments had to be dried, which was slow in the cold, damp air. So washing was done infrequently, perhaps once every few weeks, and garments were aired between washings to keep them as fresh as possible. The layering system also had a psychological dimension. The act of putting on each layer was a form of preparation, a way of mentally girding oneself for the cold. It was a ritual that marked the transition from the warmth and safety of the bed to the demands of the day. And at the end of the day, the reverse process occurred. Layers were removed one by one as the household prepared for sleep. The cloak was hung on a peg or folded and placed at the foot of the bed. The outer tunic was removed. The hose might be taken off or left on, depending on how cold the night was expected to be. The linen undergarment remained, providing a thin layer of protection during sleep, and the body, now relieved of the weight and constriction of the outer layers, settled into the bed and under the wool blankets. The layers had done their work. They had kept the body warm through the day, through the labour and the cold, and now, as night fell, a different system took over. The shared warmth of the bed, the banked fire, the enclosed space of the home. But come morning, the layers would be put on again. The wool tunic, the hose, the cloak and hood, each piece a small fortress, each layer a defence against the cold, and this would continue day after day through the long winter until the air grew warmer and the layers could finally be lightened.